The amount of air or gas that is inhaled and exhaled is largely dependent on the respiratory muscles. All right. So if you have a problem with the respiratory muscles, then you can alter lung volume and lung capacity. That's why in this video, we're going to be looking at lung volume and capacity. All right. So there are four basic types of lung volume. I'm going to start with the first one. The first is what we call the tidal volume. The tidal volume. Now, the tidal volume is around 500 milliliters, which is equivalent to 0.5 liters. All right. Now, this volume of air is just the air that you take in and take out when you are relaxed. So, as you're watching this video now, the type of air that is entering and leaving the lungs is what we call the tidal volume. All right. So, just like the tide, free air, freely, it goes into the lungs and goes out of the lung freely. Okay. That's what we call the tidal volume. Now, the next we're going to look at is the inspiratory reserve volume. Now, if you forcefully take in air into the lungs, like, all right, you are going to alter or increase the volume. So the next is inspiratory reserve volume. Inspiratory reserve volume. And it's about 2,500 milliliters, which is equivalent to 2.5 liters. All right. So this is when you forcefully take in air. Now, the next one is what we call the expiratory reserve volume. So just like you took in air, you inspired, you also expired. So if you breathe out, okay, that air that comes out, so it feels like you have released everything in the lungs. That air that comes out is what we call the expiratory reserve volume. Expiratory reserve volume. And it's about 1,500 milliliters, which is equivalent to 1.5 liters. All right. Now, whenever you breathe in and you expire, no matter how forcefully you expire, it is not all the air in the lungs that leaves the lungs. All right. We also have some amount of air remaining in the lungs, and that is what we call the residual volume, which is the last one here. The residual volume. And this is about 1,500 milliliters, which is equivalent to 1.5 liters. All right. So these are the basic type of lung volume we have. Now, look at this. Before we talk about the capacity, before we talk about the capacities, just look at this. When you take in tidal volume, right, the graph looks something like this. The graph looks like this. Okay. So it is just like a wave in an oscillatory motion. Okay, the same amount of air you take, you breathe out is the same amount of air you breathe in. Okay, now when you forcefully take in air, which is the inspiratory reserve volume, what happens is that this graph goes up. Okay, so you forcefully take in air, it shoots up just like this, and you forcefully breathe out, which is expiration, it drops again. This time it's going to drop below the expiratory, the tidal volume, and come back to the normal tidal volume. All right. Now, this is what happens here. You see this point is what we call the tidal volume. Tidal volume. All right. Now this spike here is what we call the inspiratory reserved volume. Reserve volume. Then this drop here is called the expiratory reserve volume. Expiratory reserved volume. Now, where can we find the residual volume? The residual volume is found just below the expiratory reserved volume. So from here, this point to this point, you would have your residual volume. All right. So you can have your tidal volume here, cutting across this point, the inspiratory reserve volume here, then the expiratory reserve volume here, and the residual volume here. Okay, I hope you got that. So this is the inspiratory reserve volume, which is I RV. The tidal volume, which is TV. The expiratory reserve volume, which is RV. Then the residual volume, which is RV. All right, so I hope you got that. Now, doing this in a very simple format, let's assume that our tidal volume, which is this, right? This here is about so tidal volume. What is the volume? 0.5. 0.5 liters. All right. Now, when you inhale, you are putting more air on the tidal volume. The next that comes is inspiratory reserve volume. Okay, so that inspiratory reserve volume will be on the tidal volume. All right. Now, it is 2.5 liters. That means it's going to be way more than the tidal volume. So you have this large part, and you can label that inspiratory reserve volume, which is 2.5 liters. All right. And the next thing that happens is expiration. So the expiratory reserved volume will be placed under the tidal volume, and the expiratory reserve volume is 1.5 liter. So it will be bigger than the tidal volume, but less than the inspiratory reserve volume. So let's assume this is the expiratory reserve volume, which is about 1.5 liters. All right. Now the next thing that happens is the residual volume. Now, the residual volume, where are we going to place the residual volume? The residual volume is the amount of air that is remaining in the lungs after you expire. So that will come below the expiratory reserve volume. Since it's the same volume, 1.5 liters, it will be the same size. So you label this residual volume, which is 1.5 liters. All right. So this is just about lung volume. Now, all right. So looking at the capacities now, most times when patient presents with certain lung disease, all right, if the capacity is known, then we should be able to ascertain if it is a restrictive lung disease or an obstructive lung disease. So looking at the capacities now, when you total the volume of the inspiratory reserve volume and the tidal volume, what you get, the capacity you get is what you call the inspiratory capacity. Inspiratory capacity, IC. All right, inspiratory capacity. Then when you total this volume, that of the expiratory reserve volume and the residual volume, you get what we call the functional residual capacity, which is FRC. All right. Now, when you total the inspiratory reserve volume, the tidal volume, and the expiratory reserve volume, what you get is a total of everything. And that is what we call the vital capacity. Vital capacity, VC. All right. Then, when you total everything, the inspiratory reserve volume, the tidal volume, the expiratory reserve volume, and the residual volume. So a total of everything here is what we call the total lung capacity. So total lung capacity. All right. So this is just an overview of lung volume and capacities.